Hi to everyone who's joining. Just to say that we'll get started at 12 o'clock sharp, because we've got quite a lot to get through in an hour and a half. So yeah, just hang tight a couple more minutes and then we'll get started. So I will repeat this during the introduction, but just for the people who have joined, there's a question and answer function. There's a box in, you'll see at the top of the screen that says Q&A. So you can type your questions for the speakers today in this box, and we're going to have a session at the end for questions all together to the speakers. There should also be a function to upvote any questions you think are really interesting and important. And so we can kind of go with the questions that have got a lot of votes. Okay, it is 12 o'clock now. I am going to get started. I can see there are more and more people joining. So hello to everyone who's joining. This session is being recorded. So if anyone joins a bit late, then they can catch up on anything they've missed in the recording that will be on the AllSalva website. And anyone who can't make it can also catch up. But I am going to get kicked off because we have quite a lot to get through. So thank you so much for joining today to this webinar on animal welfare and sustainability, is conflict necessary? So our schedule for today, we're going to have a quick introduction to start with, and then we've got talks at 12:15, 12:35 and 12:55, and I will be introducing our fantastic speakers that we've got today. And then at 1:15 to 1:30, we'll have a question session. So if you have any questions, then please do type them into the Q&A box, and then we'll have the session at the end for questions. But I am going to go on to an introduction now. I'm just going to give a brief introduction to the background of this webinar, and also to introduce our brilliant speakers who we've got with us today. And just to say, my name is Lizzie. I'm going to be chairing the webinar today. I'm a research associate in sustainable livestock systems at the University of Reading, and a freelance animal welfare consultant. So yeah, really, really happy to be here and happy to see so many people joining this webinar. It's brilliant. So I'm just going to share an introduction now. So the inspiration for the title of this webinar came from a 2017 paper by Marion Dawkins called Animal Welfare and Efficient Farming, is Conflict Inevitable? And in this paper, Marion summarizes how animal welfare and efficient production can go and do go hand in hand, as summarized on this slide. And so I wanted to ask the same question of animal welfare and sustainability. Is conflict really necessary between the two, or can they go hand in hand? And another source of inspiration for suggesting to Orselva to hold this webinar came from attending a animal welfare conference this year, the U4 conference. And I was in a session on animal welfare labelling, and the topic of sustainability came up, and specifically whether sustainability labelling and animal welfare labelling could go together. And in this session, it became really apparent that so many experts in animal welfare see much more conflict than harmony between animal welfare and sustainability. One example that was raised by one of the stakeholders there was that, okay, from a sustainability point of view, we should be replacing beef with chicken. Beef is bad, chicken is good. But this would mean having many chickens to replace the outputs of one beef cattle. And this would be a win for sustainability, but a loss for animal welfare because of the welfare insults that come from intensive farming. Because to have so many chickens in order to replace all the beef that we're replacing, we would need intensive farming of these chickens. And I found this example that was raised really interesting, and it's one that I've heard raised quite a lot. And it got me thinking, what did this person mean when they were talking about sustainability? What do we actually mean by sustainability? So we know that sustainability is a multifaceted concept. This is a diagram from the SAFA framework, so the Sustainability Assessment Framework for Agriculture, by the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. And you can see that the SAFA guidelines define sustainability as being made up of 4 different domains: environment, economy, social, and governance. And then within each of these domains, they're further made up by several themes. So looking at the environmental sustainability domain, this is made up of the themes of atmosphere, water, land, materials and energy, biodiversity, and you'll see that SAFA also includes animal welfare as part of environmental sustainability. I put a link at the bottom here if you want to go and look at that document in more detail. So I think that the person who raised this example of beef being bad for sustainability and chicken being better or good was talking specifically about the environmental domain of sustainability, and within the environmental domain specifically about the atmospheric theme. And I think this is what a lot of people are doing when they're thinking about sustainability. They're thinking about environmental sustainability, which is fine, and then within the environmental domain, they're concentrating on the atmosphere. We know that ruminant animals belch out methane, which is a potent greenhouse gas, and this is contributing to global warming and the climate crisis that we're facing. So I think a lot of people tend to focus on the atmosphere. A friend introduced me to the word of carbon tunnel vision that a lot of people have, which is completely understandable because we are facing a climate crisis. So we are really focusing, there's a lot of drive on greenhouse gases and getting down to net zero emissions. So there's a lot of focus on the atmospheric domain, but does that mean that we can ignore or not worry about the other themes of environmental sustainability? Can we ignore or sacrifice these? I remember another stakeholder saying something like, well, species loss is a tragedy, but it's one that we could perhaps cope with in order to focus on greenhouse gas emissions and get down to net zero. But is this true? Can we ignore the other themes within environmental integrity? And this got me thinking about another characteristic of sustainability. And for the rest of this introduction, I am just focusing on environmental sustainability. And it's that these themes don't occur in isolation, and they are interconnected. So as a brief example, thinking about biodiversity and whether we can cope with biodiversity loss in order to focus on greenhouse gas emissions. This is a slide taken by a webinar that was given by Professor Rockström, who is the director of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. This was held by Frontiers, and this is freely available now on YouTube. I put the link at the bottom, and I highly recommend you watch it if you haven't already. And Professor Rockström states in this webinar that it's the loss of biodiversity that he is actually personally most concerned about, more so than the rising greenhouse gas emissions at the moment in the face of the climate emergency. And he explains this as being due to the ecological crisis that is happening in tandem with the climate crisis, that's undermining the resilience of the living biosphere to be able to cope with stresses like the climate crisis. So science is showing that this loss of biodiversity is resulting in natural systems losing the ability to absorb carbon and buffer this stress that we're causing the planet. And so the conclusion is that safeguarding biodiversity and ecosystem functioning and services is absolutely fundamental to tackling climate change. So this is just one brief example of how environmental sustainability is it's multifaceted, and it's also the themes within it are interconnected. So we can't really ignore the other themes just to focus on one. We really need to take a holistic view of all the themes within environmental integrity in order to achieve sustainability and a healthy functioning planet. And we also need to take a holistic view of the farming system that we're talking about when we're thinking about sustainability. So going back to this original example of beef versus chicken, and beef being bad from a sustainability point of view and intensive chicken farming being good, if we take this holistic view of all the different themes within environmental sustainability and also zoom out and take a holistic view of the different systems that we are comparing. If we look at the intensive system and think about all the inputs that are needed to fuel that intensive system, all the feed that leads to feed food competition, all the resources that are needed to grow that feed, relying on fossil fuels, pesticides, the land that's needed. If we think about that, the impact of that on the different themes of environmental integrity, and then also take into account that we know that in the Western world we're eating too many animal products for our own health, and we're also wasting colossal amounts of food, which kind of calls into question this need for intensive high output systems. If we then compare that to an agroecological system that includes grazing animals, that contributes to ecosystem services and biodiversity, and that avoids feed food competition, and which in combination with dietary and behavior change could feed the human population, could we then there have a system that works for both the planet and for animal welfare? And this is why I've invited our three fantastic speakers today to talk about these kind of three different themes together, and whether taken together, these themes could mean that we could have farming for the planet and for animal welfare. So we've got Nikki Yoxall speaking on agroecological farming, Ellen Rose speaking about the avoidance of feed food competition, and Rob Percival speaking about dietary and behaviour change. So Nikki Yoxall is Head of Research at Pasture for Life, which is an organisation championing the positive impacts of grazing animals for biodiversity, carbon, human welfare and animal welfare. She's got over a decade of experience in sustainable agriculture and higher education. She sits on the board of Nature Friendly Farming Network of the Scotland Steering Group, and she's on the board of Nature Scot. She runs her own business to graze cattle for ecological and biodiversity benefits and selling their beef. She's got a master's in sustainable food and natural resources, and she's a PhD candidate in agroecology and sustainable agriculture at the University of Gloucestershire. Ellen Rose is a senior lecturer in the Division of Agricultural Engineering at the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences. Ellen researches and teaches about sustainable food production and consumption, including assessing the environmental impact of different foods, production systems, and dietary patterns, developing and modelling future scenarios on how to produce food for a growing population in a sustainable way, and investigating economic and informative policy instruments for a more sustainable food consumption. Ellen also works for Table, which is a global platform for knowledge synthesis, reflective critical thinking, and for inclusive stakeholder dialogue on the sustainable future of food. And Rob Percival is a food policy expert. He's head of food policy at Soil Association, which is a charity working to transform the way we eat, farm, and care for our natural world. Rob leads the Soil Association's advocacy for healthy and sustainable diets, including lobbying governments to improve the food served in schools, hospitals, and other public settings. He writes extensively on food and farming and has been shortlisted for multiple awards for his writing. And he's published his first book, The Meat Paradox, which takes an environmental, evolutionary, and ethical perspective to address the question, should we eat animals? And I highly recommend this book if you haven't read it already. So I'm so grateful for these three fantastic speakers to be joining us today and sharing their knowledge. I'm really excited to hear their talks. Just a reminder of the schedule and the fact that at 3:15 we will have time for questions. So please do, you can put your questions in the Q&A box as we go along whilst you're listening to the talks, but we won't answer any of the questions until we get to this last session at 3:15. So please do type your questions in the Q&A box, and you can also upvote any questions you think look really particularly interesting and you'd really like to see asked. There's a function there to upvote the questions. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Nikki Oxall, who's going to speak first. Thank you, Nikki.
Thanks so much, Lizzie, and what a brilliant introduction to really set the scene for what we're going to be talking about today. So I'm just going to share my screen and we will get started. And I'm also just going to turn my video off because I'm in snowy Aberdeenshire and everything feels like it might fall over if I try and do too many things with my Zoom account. So hopefully everybody can see my slide, though I wouldn't, I don't know. Lizzie, can you just maybe come on off mute and just confirm that it's...
Yes, that's showing perfectly, perfect. Nikki, thank you.
Amazing, thank you so much. So absolutely delighted to be here, and as Lizzie said, I am head of research at Pasture for Life, which is a certification organisation certifying 100% pasture-fed ruminant animals and the products that we get from them. So that's meat, dairy, but also fibre as well. And I am a PhD student looking at agroecological transitions at CCRI, and I'm particularly interested in connection with the more than human as a lever for transformation of farming systems towards agroecology. And I'm very much going to talk today about the farmer level, or the farm level, around animal welfare and sustainability and whether conflict is necessary. Start off with what is agroecology. I'm aware that many of you might know this already, but it's had various definitions applied over the years, which you can see on the screen there. And I think that the definition that I tend to align with most within my work is that the bottom one. So the ecology of the entire food system, which encompasses ecological, economic and social dimensions and considers global equity in terms of nutrition, health and food security. And you might be very aware that the definitions there around agroecology very closely reflect the diagram Lizzie shared from SAPA, which highlights the environmental, economic, social and governance aspects to a sustainable agricultural future. So I think it's very clear to me that there are lots of people all identifying the multifaceted, complex nature of sustainable food and farming systems. And I can't talk about agroecology without a very quick mention of Regen Ag. And for the purposes of today, I've just zoomed very much in on the one principle of regenerative agriculture that really highlights livestock integration as representing an opportunity to enable nutrient cycling through natural processes. So various, again, definitions of Regen Ag, but out of the kind of overarching 5, if you like, principles, one of them is about livestock integration to help us to create healthy soils and to reduce reliance on external inputs and chemicals. So that's agroecology. A little bit about Regen Ag. They are by some people used interchangeably, but whether that's correct or not is up for another debate, and maybe that's another conversation for another time. So I'm coming to this webinar with the assumption that animals have a role in sustainable farming futures. And I appreciate that there may be people within the webinar who disagree with that, which is absolutely fine. But my role here is to talk from perspective, recognizing that as farmers, it is our job to enact that future by ensuring positive welfare, that we can't have a sustainable farming future unless welfare is paramount as part of that future. And so I'm going to talk a bit about kind of very practical agroecology today. So I've identified 4 characteristics that you might find within agroecological livestock systems, and I just want us to have the opportunity to look at the sustainability and the welfare aspects and positives that arise from these 4 different system approaches. So we've got grazing diverse pastures, silver pasture, adaptive multi-paddock grazing, and the idea of animal family groups and natural weaning. And I think other than this picture of a goat being milked, most of my photos are of cattle. That is because, as Lizzie said, I do own cattle, so it's easy for me to get lovely photos of them. So it's not to say that sheep don't also feature, or goats, but you will see a lot of cattle in this presentation. Okay, so let's crack on. So grazing diverse pastures. Diverse pastures generally are open grassy habitats, and we would refer to them as species-rich grasslands if they have 15 or more plant species, and they form a core element, particularly of agroecological and pasture for life farm systems. They represent high species richness and abundance, and they are also vital for pollinators. From a sustainability point of view, these grasslands are absolutely critical to ensure that we have future security of our food system because of that very clear link through to pollinators and to other insects as well. They are also a store of very important carbon stocks within the soil, and generally these diverse pastures aren't ploughed, they're not cultivated, so that soil is left to maintain its integrity and keep that carbon locked into the soil. As I've said, reduced tillage, so therefore reduced use of fossil fuels to manage these types of diverse pastures. But we also would include things like herbal lays, which are the diverse multi-species swards, so sward being the grass and plants that you might plant in between arable crops so that you can protect the soil, but also add nutrients in, and part of that system, that herbal lay. And from a sustainability point of view, these pastures are really, really important, as I've already identified, but they also serve a really strong role in terms of animal welfare. So complex and diverse diets, and that mixed bite is a really important aspect of maintaining a balanced rumen function. So if a cow comes along and with its big tongue, it sweeps through that grassland and it picks some of that really green stuff at the bottom, and you can see the yellow rattler's got a bit taller and stemmier in that photograph. The animal is going to have a nice diverse plate of food, if you like, in front of it. And as it goes through the rumen, the slightly older plants are going to slow down the highly proteinous plant leaf matter that's going through, and will help that animal to absorb all the nutrients that it needs to. And this idea of foggage, which is an old word for deferred grazing or standard hay, helps us to extend the grazing season. And we know that extending the grazing season actually also links back into sustainability by helping us to significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions from animals, because we're not having to manage slurry or manure in the same way that we would if there is direct deposition, and that dung falls and that urine falls and becomes part of the natural nutrient cycling that happens on pasture. So these diverse pastures have a really, really important role to play. And in the UK, species-rich grasslands are hugely at risk, and we are losing them every year through undergrazing, overgrazing, agricultural improvement, but also afforestation. So they're a very important part of our ecosystem that we must work to maintain. I'm now going to talk about one of my favourite topics in the world, which is cows in trees, also known as silvopasture. So this is the intentional integration of livestock and trees and falls under the umbrella term of agroforestry. From a sustainability point of view, we see increased carbon stocks above ground. Obviously, we've got trees on that pasture, so a massive difference to the amount of carbon sequestration and cycling that can happen on that land area. We have increased biodiversity and biomass, and they can reduce the need for bought-in supplements, though monitoring is required to make sure that obviously we're not putting the animals at risk. So, for example, we have our cattle tested frequently, and selenium is something that we really struggle to access because of the soils across the UK. Most farms will tell you that they're selenium deficient. However, our selenium readings for our cattle are always really, really high, and we absolutely put that down to the amount of willow that they're able to access. So we know different plants can contribute, particularly things like selenium, also cobalt, and for us iron as well. And hawthorn is a real favourite of the cows in the springtime when it's at its highest in iron content. So that reduces the need for us to buy in supplements, and obviously those supplements have an energy cost. They come from somewhere, they've had to have been extracted. So if we can access those things from within the farm system and close that loop, then obviously there's going to be a sustainability impact, but also that welfare impact as well. Trees are absolutely brilliant for providing shade, shelter, and enabling that nutrient availability I've already talked about. And most importantly for me, I think, is natural behaviours. If an animal's got an itch somewhere on a hard to reach place, it's always wonderful to see them having a good old scratch on some of the trees, particularly those branches that hang down low and can give the absolutely kind of perfect angle for a back scratch for the cattle. They also, interestingly, contribute to more stable social hierarchies within the herd. And there was some research done in South America that explored having cattle in silvopasture systems compared to those in open grassland. And they identified that there were more socially positive behaviours and more stable social hierarchies within the silvopasture systems. And we definitely find that when introducing new cattle to the herd, for example, we'd want to do that in a treed area like this. And I think the cattle just find that having trees between them and animals that are higher in the herd is just a kind of there's that sort of self-preservation almost, or protection. So silvopasture is just so important. And actually the photographs that Lizzie shared at the beginning, the little calf in that picture, Annie, is this calf here, and she's now actually a mother. What you can't see is her calf behind her, just beyond her shoulder, also reaching up, trying to reach the trees as well. So there's definitely those links between that learned behaviour, which I'm going to come to a little bit later on. So I want to talk now about adaptive multi-paddock grazing, a catch-all term for approaches you may hear of, like mob grazing, tall grass grazing, to some extent rotational grazing, but that's normally a little bit more less frequent moves than we would see in an AMP system, or holistic plan grazing. And this is where we control the livestock grazing impact and we create rest in the system. That's the most important here, is that everywhere the cattle aren't is allowed to rest and is able to express itself in terms of the plant expression and create quiet, undisturbed habitat for wildlife. So from a sustainability point of view, this approach increases the carrying capacity per unit of land. We've got some really interesting research that's come out of Rothamsted that demonstrates that. And it extends the grazing season. So it means that we can keep our cattle outside longer, which means that we have more dung available for dung beetles as we go into the winter time, which is quite often when animals are taken off the land. And as I've already said, that rested area creates space for wildlife and for plant expression. And from a welfare point of view, the frequent or daily checking of mobility, behaviours and dung is really important for checking that health and the welfare of the animals. The habitual routine, any of you that maybe have worked with cattle or know cattle will know that they kind of quite quickly fall into habits and routines. So it's quite positive for them. They kind of know that they're going to be moving on. They get that frequent, and for our cattle and for many others implementing the system, a daily fresh bite of grass. And it means that we can actually, because we're taking an adaptive approach, we can meet the needs of the cattle, such as shade and shelter. So for example, this electric fence that you can see here, possibly on the left-hand side behind the cattle, you can see there is a lovely thick hedge. So if, for example, we had really hot weather and these cattle needed to be able to get back to that hedge to take some shade, then because this is an adaptive approach, we can take down the electric fence and let them get back to that shade. So it's really important that in these systems, we don't become too fixed as to how we have to take the system forward without always prioritising and privileging animal welfare and health and welfare at the centre of everything that we do. And finally, I very quickly want to talk about family groups and natural weaning. So late or natural weaning and maintaining mixed stock classes is something that we see increasingly within pastured for life systems and within agroecological. A lot of previous technical guidance for farmers would suggest to wean at 5 months. I'm hoping you can hear me okay, because it's saying my internet connection is unstable. But many farmers within these systems will wean towards 10 months time. And on our farm and other similar farms, we implement a natural weaning process, which allows our cows to almost kind of knock off or kick off the calves as they get to about 10 months. They then dry themselves off. So they stop lactating, they stop producing milk, so that they're ready with their colostrum for their new calf when we start calving in May. And we find that these mixed stock classes are really beneficial as well in terms of learned behaviours. And again, I've noticed that Annie, the calf, is featuring on this photograph as well, heading off into the trees on some sort of adventure. From a sustainability point of view, this really helps by keeping those mixed stock classes together, reduces the number of groups. So we don't have a cow group and a calf group and a young stock group. Everybody's in together. And that means that we've got more rest across the rest of the grazing platform, which helps us to create, as I've already identified with AMP, that additional time for rest and recovery of the grounds, but also for plant expression and wildlife habitat. It allows us also, particularly that natural weaning process, to reduce supplementary requirements, which obviously always have a bought-in or an energy cost associated with them. So creating that kind of closed loop nutrient cycling on farm. The welfare, obviously, that maternal bond is maintained, and there are opportunities for learned behaviour, which we've already touched on with Annie and her tree eating, reduces the stress of separation and maintains really positive herd dynamics. And we do see at times, it's really lovely actually seeing a cow who will be maybe engaging in mutual grooming behaviour with a previous or 2 years ago calf, with current calf maybe suckling or standing nearby. And it's very, it's a real privilege to be able to see that kind of herd dynamic and that behaviour expressing itself on the farm. So I recognise that I'm just coming to the end of my section. So what I want to do is just very quickly touch on some of the activities that Pasture for Life are engaged in to ensure that we have highly sustainable but also high welfare livestock systems. And obviously our certification standard really does promote high welfare, and it's something that we're very proud of, that it forms a very central part of our system requirements. But some of the work that we're doing, as you can see here, just some examples of that top photograph is one of our farm walks. That was one of our Scotland farm walks, where we were looking at how to use Soil Mentor to measure farm soil health and, you know, very much meeting that sustainability aspect. The bottom photo is actually me looking at dung beetles and worms with somebody on our with the child of one of our farm walk attendees, and so really always trying to highlight that actually high welfare for animals, and also that broader One Health approach, so that actually we're not just thinking about just the animals, we're also thinking about ourselves and how we engage with each other. And then on the right, I've just put some examples of the projects that we're involved in. So we're involved in the Pathways project, which delighted to be working with Lizzie and others on that, which has one of the work packages actually includes a kind of quantification of how welfare systems align with sustainability metrics. Re-Livestock, which has just started, is another European project that we're involved in, looking at various different kind of resilient livestock systems across Europe. We were delighted to be involved in both SEAGLIP and SUSCAP, both of which have got outputs that are currently available now that are just being published, and particularly recognise that Pasture for Life farms from the SEAGLIP project have more structural diversity and higher biodiversity in their grasslands than conventional farms. We've been working with Pilio to understand how best to quantify public goods and how to support farms to access funding for those. And Vidacycle, who owns Soil Mentor, have been a key partner in a lot of the work that we do. And we're currently also working with the Bionutrient Institute to assess the human health, nutrient accessibility for meat produced in these systems. And I do just want to draw your attention to the Vet Sustain work that we have been working with, and I think Alex Tomlinson's actually in the call possibly. And Alex has been absolutely essential to developing this resource for farmers, to help them to in support of their understanding of pasture for life systems, which may seem very different from all conventional systems that they've worked in previously. So hopefully that whistle-stop tour through Pasture for Life has given you a flavour of what we're doing and what our farmers are doing in relation to meeting those multiple requirements of sustainability in the broadest sense, and also animal welfare. If you're interested in any of our work, do contact me via email, nikki@pastureforlife.org. And if you're on Twitter, you can follow me and what we get up to with the wee mob by finding me at @HowMill. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing and hand back to Lizzie.
Thank you so much, Nikki, for such a fantastic talk, really fascinating. And thank you for keeping within time. That's fantastic. Just a reminder that if you have any questions for Nikki, to put them in the Q&A chat box, and we'll get to them at the end. I'm now going to pass over to Ellen for her talk. Thank you so much, Ellen.
Great, thanks. Can you see my screen now?
Yes.
My presentation?
Perfect.
Yeah. Okay,
yeah.
Great. So thanks a lot for inviting me to this very interesting webinar on a very important topic, I think. As Lizzie introduced, I work broadly with food system sustainability, and animal welfare is, of course, a very important part of that. But here I'm going to try to kind of answer this question and show why different people might come to different conclusions regarding, if there's a conflict between animal welfare and sustainability. So is conflict necessary? And I think if we're looking at the narrative of sustainable intensification, the answer to that question would be yes. And I think also that was the concern that many of the scientists at that conference that you attended, Lizzie, expressed, that under this narrative that we need to produce more food and we need to do it more efficiently, there is definitely a risk of conflict here. And so I think that many on this call are already aware of the sustainable intensification narrative, but just for those who might be new to that concept, what it basically is about is this fact, of course, that the global population is increasing. So that's a fact. What's also a fact is that demand for animal products is increasing. So when people get richer and move to cities and so on, they tend to eat and demand more of animal products. So that we also know, and what we've seen historically, as can also be seen in this graph here, that there's been a massive increase in animal product consumption, both in total but also per capita. So this narrative of sustainable intensification, which is the dominating narrative of today, is that in order to feed these people and to do that with reduced environmental impacts, we need to produce more food with fewer inputs. And that means, of course, higher yields from the land we're already farming, and also more meat, eggs, and milk from the same amount of feed. So how can we then, under this narrative now, or reduce the environmental impacts of meat? So the most important one here is, of course, to increase the efficiency. So produce more, as I said, animal products out of the same amount of feed. And that, of course, also we've seen historically with massive increases in efficiency when it comes to milk yields and animal growth also, due to improved breeding, improved management, feeding, and so on. But we could also reduce impacts using technological solutions. So for example, we could digest the manure and get biogas out, reduce methane emissions from manure and so on. We could use renewable fuels in machinery. So there are several ways of using technology to reduce impacts. And of course, we could improve management and hopefully then have healthier animals and reduced mortality. So these are all ways of reducing the environmental impact per kilo of food produced. So let's look, and also then this also has the implication, like Lizzie talked about, like it's really a move from ruminant animals to monogastrics like pork and poultry that makes sense under this narrative because of the reduced emissions. So here it's a graph of the emission intensity per kilo of protein for beef. You can see it's considerably higher than from pork and chicken. So within this narrative, it makes sense to move from these high emitting sources of protein to the monogastric animal products. But if we look at the consequences of these strategies then for animal welfare, we know that this increased efficiency has come with a high cost in terms of animal health and welfare. So I've made this very simple now, and there's exceptions, but we could say that that's usually bad for animal welfare. When it comes to the technological solutions, you could simplify and say that they're usually neutral. So it doesn't really matter for the animal if the tractor is, using renewable fuels. There are, of course, technological solutions that might be, good or bad for animal welfare, but just in simplified terms, we can conclude that they're usually neutral to animal welfare. And better management, that could, I would say, usually good for animal welfare if it reduces disease and injuries and reduces mortality. But of course, depends on the type of management you put in place, how it would affect. But it's usually good for animal welfare. But of course, as we can see here, since the focus in this narrative is very much on increased efficiency, there's a clear risk of a conflict between animal welfare and sustainability. But of course, we have this contrasting narrative of an agroecological transition, and I'm very glad that Nikki was before me, because now I don't have to say so much about what that is about. So that was a very good introduction. But here, the role of the animals is not primarily to produce as much meat and dairy as efficiently as possible, but rather their role in the whole farming system is to make use of resources that we as humans cannot eat directly. So that could be grass from grasslands, as we saw in Nikki's example here, but it could also be crop residues like straw, for example, and it could also be residues from the food industry when we produce, for example, rapeseed oil. There's rapeseed cake, which is not very nice to eat directly, even if you could, but it's a good animal feed. So there could also be residues from the food industry. So the role of the animals here is really to make use of these resources and transform these non-human edible resources into valuable foods like meat and dairy. So this concept has been called quite some different things, livestock on leftovers, default livestock, and so on. But it's basically about limiting the animal production to the resources that are non-human edible. And there's been quite a few modeling studies calculating like how much protein, animal protein, could we then produce from such systems. And it depends very much on where you draw the boundaries, if you look at a specific country or Europe or the globe as a whole, and also what you consider are non-human edible resources. And if you include food waste, for example, as a feed source for pigs. But this study that I referred to here summarized quite some of these modeling studies and came to the conclusion that approximately 9 to 23 grams of protein per capita per day could be produced from these resources, which is quite a substantial amount, but still, of course, a lot less than we produce today in livestock systems as a whole. So basically what this is about is making use of what we currently give to animals as feed, as food that we consume directly. And I think this is a very interesting diagram to kind of show this. And if we start up here, see that out from land, the farmed land, we have edible crop harvest, so things that we could eat that corresponds to 4,600 calories capita per day. And we lose some in post-harvest losses. So there's losses in storage, for example, and so on. Then we have a massive amount of losses here, you can say, in terms of what we feed to animals. Of course, we get some meat and dairy back from that. You see that that's about 1/4 of the food that we put into the livestock systems. So it's really a loss of energy. And then, of course, we also lose some food then in later stages in food waste in households and so on. This concept is really about taking away the loss and restricting livestock feeding and livestock production to these resources that do not compete with our food. So how is then animal suffering reduced in these systems? And Nikki already gave some more detailed descriptions of this, but in general, we can say that there's going to be reductions in animal numbers. Ruminants are going to be favored over pigs and poultry, because pigs and poultry, monogastric animals, they need to eat the type of food that we can also eat. But ruminants can make use of these high cellulose resources that we as humans cannot digest. And what we also find in all these types of studies is that grass-fed ruminants are favored, of course, over grain-fed for the same reason. And I would say that all these are also good then for animal welfare. So here the answer to this question we had, is conflict necessary, would be no, because in this kind of narrative we can combine good animal welfare with a sensible use of the resources we have. I still put this yes here in parentheses, because of course there can always be bad systems. I mean, even extensively managed systems can be managed badly, for example, as Nikki talked about, the shade and so on. So but that goes for all livestock systems, that there are always going to be some bad examples of management. So that we need always to be mindful of. But then the question, of course, is, could then these agroecological food systems feed the world? And there's been quite a few modeling studies on this topic as well. And the conclusion that all of them come to is that, yes, these systems can feed the world, but it will require changes in diet, so reductions in animal product consumption and food waste, because these systems, they cannot meet this total demand, this growing total demand for meat and livestock products that we see globally. So this has to go hand in hand with a reduction in consumption. And what we also see is that we need some external nutrient sources. So so we need also, so for example, in organic systems, it's not allowed to bring in nutrients in synthetic fertilizers, for example. But we see that when we model these agroecological systems, there's also a small lack of nutrients, even if we recycle all the nutrients back from society in our human waste and so on. So we need to allow some external nutrient sources. And that could come, for example, from mineral or synthetic fertilizers produced by renewable energy, or there's technology to use resources from the oceans to produce fertilizer and so on. So under these assumptions, it's totally possible to have an agroecological food system. And I just bring in one example here of a study that we published recently, where we looked at scenarios for Europe. So we developed together with stakeholders 5 scenarios, and those are the ones you see here on the left side here. So we had a business as usual scenario where developments basically continue as they do today. We had also an agroecological scenario, but where the agroecological products were kind of produced on top of everything else. and just exported. So here agroecology was used as a way to increase exports and produce products with higher value. And then we had two scenarios where we had more localized food systems, so keeping consumption closer to the production. And then we have this one, which is most relevant for today's discussion, this local agroecological food system, where we localize production more. We adopted it to agroecological practices, so a lot more grass-fed ruminant production and a lot less of monogastric production, and also drastic changes in diets in this scenario. So what this bar diagram shows here is how much of the demand could be supplied in these scenarios. So when it's 100%, then demand matches supply. So this gray here is 2012. So how you interpret this is that the EU is more or less self-sufficient in food, or could be. I mean, there's a lot of trade going on, but this is the theoretical potential to feed ourselves. So in 2012, we could do that, more or less. But then you see how this feasibility increases in all the scenarios, and it increases most in this agroecological scenario here, because of reductions in food waste, because of dietary change, and also moving more of the animal production onto the grasslands. So with a combination of dietary change, reductions in waste, there's absolutely a way of feeding the world with agroecological practices, if that is what we want, so to say. We also looked at some regional feasibilities. So here these maps show how different regions in Europe could potentially supply themselves with food. And this is the one on the left is 2012. The one on the right is this agroecological food system. And the greener, the better. So the more green, higher possibility to supply that region with food. So, of course, where we have big cities like Madrid in Spain, we have little land in comparison to the population. So there it will be tricky, but you can see that this bigger area around Madrid really goes from light green here to dark green and so on. But this is mostly a consequence of dietary change. There are also trade-offs that we need to consider. And this is from another of these modeling studies that we did. And what this diagram shows here is that you have the amount of animal source foods in diets here on this axis here. So when that is 0, so when we have a vegan diet or a totally plant-based diet, emissions of greenhouse gases will be the lowest. And when we introduce animals here, emissions will rise. But you see a different pattern here for land use, actually, because lowest land use is actually when we have some animal source foods in the diet, because then we need to use less cropland to produce the total diet, because some of it comes from these resources that we can't eat directly. So there's a trade-off between cropland use on the one hand side, which is reduced with some animal production in the system, and greenhouse gas emissions. And also, I mean, putting in some, critical reflections into this agroecological vision of the future. Will we be able to curb this demand for meat? So that's a very crucial question here if we're going to make this add up, so to say. And just finally, realizing that this food system sustainability, as we've seen now from the two previous presentations, involves a lot of sustainability aspects, and it's all a big balancing act. So there's not like one win-win-win solution. It's all about balancing quite many aspects that we need to consider. The good thing with the more extensive agroecological ways of producing meat and dairy is that they have many benefits in terms of animal welfare, in terms of preserving biodiversity in these biodiverse rich pastures, and so on. So there's many benefits to those systems, but there's also the greenhouse gas emissions, the emissions of methane. So here we need to find the right balance and the right amount of animals, and also think about where we have those globally, because not all pastures globally are these biodiverse rich ones. There's also a lot of pastures that have been recently deforested and so on. So just want to conclude with this picture to say that it's really about balancing a multitude of aspects and finding the best way forward here. And of course, why do people differ in their perceptions of what is the best solution? Is because they put different priority, of course, on different things, and they also have different risk perceptions and also different beliefs about what is possible to change. Is it possible to curb meat demand, for example, or not? So there's many good reasons why people disagree, because it's a very complex system that we're dealing with. Okay, thanks.
Thank you so much, Ellen. Absolutely fantastic talk. Really, really enjoyed that. Hope everyone else did as well. I'm going to move swiftly on to Rob, just so we've got plenty of time at the end for a discussion. So passing over to you now, Rob. And yes.
Great, I'm hoping you can see that.
Yeah, we can see that. Thank you.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for having me. This is me. I'm head of food policy at the Soil Association, an organisation that advocates for agroecological food and farming, and the author of this book, The Meat Paradox. And I'm going to cover some common ground with the other two presenters. It's tricky going third, but also some new perspectives to bring. Bear with me a minute. So, starting with the really big picture, so taking a step back, why do we eat animals at all? Well, we've been doing so for around 3 million years, foraging and hunting and more recently farming. And animals have long been an important source of nutrition. We've eaten meat, fat, bones, brains, and offal, and these have provided amino acids, iron, zinc, B12, long chain omegas, everything our brains needed to evolve. And almost every society that's ever existed has eaten animal foods in some form. They continue to play, for many people, a critical role in nutrition today, as they have for a very long time. But our capacity for ecological disturbance also runs deep. We've been altering ecosystems for tens of thousands of years. This is an image of lost megafauna, large mammals that have fallen into extinction. Climate change certainly played a role in various of these. It's still being debated what role hunting played, but we've been reshaping landscapes for tens of thousands of years, and this negotiation between animal-derived nutrition and ecological impact, which our society is grappling with, is actually profoundly old. The headline here is the important bit. Farming has really transformed our planet far beyond anything that our ancestors achieved. Around 50% of the Earth's habitable land is used for agriculture, of which 77% is used to graze animals or produce crops to feed to animals. And this is a slide, by the way, from the recent National Food Strategy led by Henry Dimbleby, which is well worth a read. So 77% of agricultural land committed to animals, but this only produces 18% of the calories that we consume. And there's lots to unpick here. Calories are a limited measure of nutrition. Lots of this land use makes sense, lots of it doesn't. But the overall picture is clear. We dedicate a huge amount of land globally to farming animals. And this land use will need to be reined in if we're to resolve the climate and nature crises. Land use change, along with fossil fuels, really is at the very center of these crises. Agriculture is the primary cause of land use. Grazing land for beef cattle, production of feed crops such as soy for intensive systems are fueling this land degradation. And we can't meet the Paris Climate Agreement. We won't meet any of the commitments that are going to be hopefully agreed at the COP15 conference in Montreal this week, unless we radically change the way that we farm, eat, and use our land. And diet change is really at the center of this. Again, this slide comes with a big caveat. There's huge local and regional variation in land use. A cow can be doing tremendous good in one place and associated with great harm in another. But the overall picture, again, is that we need to shift our land use and diets in tandem. One thing that hasn't been mentioned, I don't think so far, but is really important in this broader sustainability piece, is the risk of zoonotic disease, and associated with that, the overuse of antibiotics. As wild habitats are cleared for pasture or soy, wild animals are exposed to humans and domesticated species, and this can increase the risk of spillover. And intensive animal farming provides the conditions for pathogens to mutate and evolve, as we've seen with intensive poultry farms recently acting as a reservoir for avian influenza. And this disease, as I'm sure you'll all be aware, has been an absolute disaster for wild birds and caused in no small part by industrial poultry farming. We've already seen this graph on the left. Global demand for meat and animal foods is rising, is set to continue to rise. While consumption has plateaued in some affluent nations, there's nowhere in the world where it's in significant decline. And as the population grows, it's anticipated that 70% more meat will need to be produced if we're to meet that demand by the middle of this century. And that's straightforwardly impossible. The graph on the left is rising meat production. The graph on the right is declining wild animal populations. The cause of these declines is complex. There are multiple drivers, but the two trends are directly related. Animal farming is at a global level driving the loss of wild animal life. And we now have the situation where 96% of the mammals on the planet by biomass are humans and our livestock. So on the left there, you can see the little green speck. This used to be people relative to wild animals, but it's now the case that just 4% of animals left are wild. But there's an important detail beneath this trend. It's really the growth of chicken, which has been the phenomenon in the past few decades. This is the annual number of animals slaughtered for meat, and you can see, I don't know if you can see the detail, but that steeply curved line is the growth of chicken. And chicken is the world's favorite meat. It's the UK's favorite meat. Consumption of chicken is rising year on year in the UK. Demand is rising, and that's true across most nations. And we're not seeing anywhere where chicken is falling out of favor. So this is really the global trend. And this is, I think this photo might actually be from the US, but it's representative of UK production across Europe. The vast majority of this chicken is intensively farmed, fast-growing breeds. Chicken, as we heard in the introduction, has a reputation as a clean meat. It can be seen as environmentally benign, or it's sometimes said to be, compared to red meat. And there's some rationale for this, as we've heard. Measured per gram of protein, chicken can have a lower greenhouse gas footprint than beef or dairy, potentially a lower land use footprint as well. But this is very partial accounting, which masks the scale of impact. Huge environmental issues associated with feed. Feed production in the Americas is driving deforestation, excess agrochemical use, hazardous pesticide use. We import to the UK some 3 million tons of soya every year, and there are all kinds of environmental harms associated with that soya down the supply chain. And then here in the UK, intensive livestock systems, and poultry in particular, are fouling our air and our water, damaging our rivers. And antibiotic use and zoonotic disease are of significant concern. And of course, as we've heard, chickens suffer some of the worst welfare issues associated primarily with their rapid growth and the conditions in which they're housed. The RSPCA has characterized the life of the average British broiler chicken as eat, sit, suffer, repeat. Many of these birds will suffer heart failure, metabolic dysfunction, their skeleton will fracture under their weight of their body. All things considered, industrial chicken farming is probably the most ethically bankrupt and ecologically destructive business in Britain today. That's not true of all animal farming. As we've heard, there's an important niche for ruminants in agroecological systems. There are ways of feeding and rearing animals which are much more nature friendly and better for welfare. As Nikki elaborated, grazing animals can help maintain habitats, biodiverse pastures. Their manures can contribute to soil health. When integrated with crops, they can contribute to a diverse agroecosystem. And free-ranging and organic systems are not without welfare challenges or ethical concerns. We still kill these animals, but it's a world away from the industrial chicken shed, and a huge potential for environmental benefit and welfare improvements associated with these systems. But this is the challenge. Land use, as we've already heard, is the trade-off. 80% of the land, sorry, 85% of the land that feeds the UK, both domestically and abroad, is already committed to animal farming one way or another. Huge swathes of the UK are relatively depleted in nature and grazed by ruminants. So much of our grassland has been harmed by synthetic fertilizers over the years. We don't have these biodiverse pastures that Nikki was alluding to everywhere by any means. We have these luminous bright green ryegrass monocrops, which we often associate with the countryside, these bright green fields, but actually they're not very good for wildlife. 50% of our arable land is producing feed for humans instead of animals, sorry, animals instead of humans. And the increased demands are being placed on our land as the climate and nature crises escalate. We need to give some land back to nature, taking it out of production. We need to bring nature back onto farms. We need to capture carbon in both soils and trees. There are obvious potential benefits to rewilding, as well as shifting to more agroecological modes of production. And of course, we need to improve animal welfare outcomes. So we have this jigsaw puzzle. And the only way that all this can be attained is through dietary change. If we commit to higher welfare farming, we'll need to eat less meat. If we commit to nature-friendly farming, we cannot expect to produce the same volume of meat as today. And we heard in the previous presentation, there have been models that have looked at what this balance of the diet might look like in the future if we farmed like this, if we aligned our diets accordingly. We've modeled what a higher welfare, nature-friendly farming systems looks like, an agroecological or organic system at both a UK or EU level. And this is a model that assumes we're producing enough healthy food for a growing population. We're phasing out low welfare and industrial farming. We're minimizing food feed competition. We're minimizing use of agrochemicals. We're shifting to more organic style production. This particular model enables 1.8 million hectares of farmland in the UK to be committed to nature, so significant land sparing. It also hypothetically frees up over 1 million hectares overseas, as it assumes the phase out of imported soya, and it delivers much improved standards of animal welfare. And this is the diet change required to enable such a scenario. So broadly speaking, we're talking about less and better meat, especially much less grain-fed meat and more and better plants. The details can be taken with a pinch of salt. This is a model. There are dozens of assumptions underpinning the model. And if you alter those assumptions, you'd reach a different dietary conclusion. There are farmers out there who are innovating and sustainably boosting yields. So there are ways in which we could perhaps get a bit more ruminant meat into the system. There are these percentage figures are also, they should be read as UK population level averages. So this is what broadly we're talking about across the population. But this allows for significant individual variation. We can have lots and lots of vegans and various folks eating a more carnivorous diet, as long as it balances out across the big picture. And of course, there's lots of people who are nutritionally malnourished or vulnerable who would benefit from eating more meat, not less. And this is true globally and in the UK. But this is, broadly speaking, the type of dietary change that's required if we're to resolve the climate and nature crises, adopt a higher welfare farming system. And there are various models out there, as Lynn said, there's lots of modeling that's been done, each of them seeking to establish a sustainable dietary pattern. And though there are differences, they broadly say much the same thing. This is pretty much the type of dietary change we should be thinking about this decade and beyond, if we're going to address all the challenges that are that are before us. I'm not going to spend much time on this because we've talked a lot about agroecology, but just to flag that diet change is a crucial component within this vision of an agroecological farming system, as well as making space for nature to thrive, rebalancing power across supply chains, enabling producer autonomy, and building connections across the global movement for land rights and agroecology. Diet change is part of the equation that makes this big vision possible. And I wonder if, I don't know if anyone will know what these are, but these are brewing vats, but not for alcohol. They're vats for precision fermentation, which you might have heard of. There's a bit of buzz around it recently. Precision fermentation is one of a wave of novel technologies which is promising to sort of disrupt the status quo. It's essentially a refined form of brewing, a means of multiplying microbes in a vat to create specific products. It's been used for many years to produce drugs and food additives, but now various labs and a few factories are developing what could be a new generation of staple foods. And these foods, some believe, could soon be competing with meat and dairy. The more enthusiastic advocates for precision fermentation and for cellular agriculture more broadly, there's also lab-grown meat, which is slightly different in development. But the more enthusiastic advocates believe that these novel technologies could soon make livestock farming completely obsolete. The future, they say, will be plant-based and our diets supplemented by novel proteins. I think it's probably too early to say how disruptive these technologies will be. And I don't buy into this dichotomous framing. I think we should stay open-minded about the potential benefits of precision fermentation and lab-grown meat and so on. Growing global demand for meat and animal foods, as we've heard repeatedly, cannot be sustainably met. And in order to enable this agroecological transition, we're going to have to shift diets. So alternatives produced by precision fermentation and cellular ag might have a role to play in that shift. There are risks associated with these technologies being scaled, but there are also opportunities. And these novel foods pose, I think, challenging and I think some interesting questions. If we can produce adequate nutrition in the lab, and that's a big if, do we really need to be farming and killing animals for food? In what circumstances are farmed animals of genuine ecological benefit? And what if we employed animals primarily for their ecological function, treated their meat as a valuable byproduct instead of seeing them as a commodity? Is there a case for minimizing animal slaughter? Is it possible that these novel technologies could contribute to a more ethical and nature-friendly farming system? And what role might they play alongside the type of production that Nikki was describing earlier? Can they coexist? There's lots and lots to unpick, and this is all in the pipeline for this decade. I'm squarely of the view that we need animals on the land, but there is disruption on the horizon. And finally, I wanted to just step back again to the big picture. You'll have noticed that conversations about dietary change can become heated. The meat debate is polarized and often divisive. And I discussed some of this in the Meat Paradox in the book I recently published, exploring how our relationship with meat became so complicated and contradictory. And it is contradictory. At the moment, repeated polls across the UK find that 1 in 3 people claim they are eating less meat, citing ethical and environmental concerns primarily. But this is not what sales and production data show. We're not eating significantly less meat. Almost everyone similarly claims to care about animal welfare, but it's low welfare industrial farming which provides most of our meat. There's a gap between our value and our behavior, between what we say and what we do. And this complexity actually runs very deep. In the book, I looked for the earliest evidence that the meat and animal foods had become the focus of ritual and cultural storytelling, tracing this back to the painted caves of the Paleolithic. This is a bison painted on the walls of a cave that I visited in the south of France while researching the book. We can see actually when we look back across history that animals have always been the focus of really complicated social rituals. They're the food source that's most heavily tabooed, that we tell the most complex stories about, and the food source that is simultaneously most celebrated and also most problematic across different societies. So the debate that we're seeing spill over social media and so on, associated with the mainstreaming of veganism, the climate crisis, all the stuff which seems very modern and contemporary, actually has a much broader context. And part of the reason that it's proving very difficult to shift diets is because of this deep psychological complexity, the way in which animal foods are entrenched in our culture and our psyche. So final closing thought is that we do need to change diets. It's really the key to aligning sustainability and animal welfare. It's the key to enabling this agroecological transition. How we do that is another conversation. There's lots to unpick on that front, but it's now suffice to say that this dietary change is urgently required. Thank you very much. Stop there.
Thank you so much, Rob. Absolutely fantastic talk. Just totally blown away by all three speakers today. And I'm gonna just dive straight into questions actually, because we do only have 15 minutes. So yeah, I'll invite, or you already have, thank you all the speakers to come back. I might start with the last question that's been asked, which Nikki has highlighted that she'd like to kick off with. It's a really interesting question. So, are there examples of regenerative agriculture systems with integration of chicken or pork? Or are they viable mostly with the integration of cattle? I see in Asia lots of regenerative agriculture examples without any animal integration. Is that even possible? So yeah, Nikki, would you like to kick off with that one?
Thanks, Lizzie. Yeah, and thank you to the person who asked that question. I think it's really interesting, and that's why I wanted to jump in, because there are some really great examples, and in the UK as well. For example, Fred Price, who farms at Gothelney Farm in, I think, Somerset, is integrating pigs, basically who are on a very high proportion of their diet is grazing these herbal A's that I mentioned earlier. And we are seeing a number of farmers, particularly in Scotland, actually looking to integrate chickens and turkeys into their systems. And it's actually something we previously had done, was integrate turkeys into our system. But and following cattle, for example, or using them to come in and access kind of food waste, particularly in a horticultural setting. So some really nice examples of pigs being used to actually cultivate soil prior to a new crop going in. So there are definitely examples, and I would say that they generally are small scale, though Rob may know of others that are on a larger scale. And to come to the point of the question around, is it possible to do regen ag without animals? Well, there are, you're right, some really great examples, particularly in Asia where that is happening. And I think if those farms are able to produce really high nutritious food in a way that is maintaining or improving soil health, then who's to say that that it's not regenerative? So I think that, you know, absolutely, it's about how I think there's a risk that we become wedded to say that regenerative agriculture must include livestock. I think it's a really good way to move away from chemicals, to reintroduce livestock into these systems. That doesn't mean that without livestock, a system isn't regenerative. So yeah, I don't know, maybe Rob, you've got some experience of other systems that are similar.
No, that was a great answer.
Yeah, I think
maybe I can add something, because yeah, I also agree with the answer. And we're also working here on giving biomass from grass clover lace to pigs, and they can eat substantial amounts, or substantial portions of their diet can come from this grass, but they still need quite a lot of grains to survive. So I think it's a question of how we define regenerative, because many of these systems might need an input from outside the farm in terms of grains, for example, for the poultry and the pigs. But that grain can of course be produced in good crop rotations with ley, and so it's really a scale of things, and how it depends on exactly how you define what is regenerative or agroecological and so on. And I can also mention an interesting farm I visited in Finland, three organic farms actually collaborating. They didn't have any animals, but they had a lot of grass and ley in their crop rotations to provide nitrogen and to help fight what's it called now? It's the weeds. Yeah. So the ley is really helping in the crop rotation. But instead of using the biomass for animals, they fed it into a biogas reactor that an energy company was running, producing vehicle fuel. So that's also another example of a system without animals, but still providing these benefits to the cropping system. So there's multiple ways of accomplishing this, I would say.
Thank you, Ellen. I think all of you have touched on something that's really important, that it isn't all or nothing, and this debate gets so polarized so often, and that things happen on a spectrum, and that there can be some systems with no animals, there can be some where animals are integral. So I find that really interesting. I'm just going to invite all of the speakers to come off mute, just so that you then appear on everyone's screen, so you kind of as a panel. So hello, and then we can keep going through some questions. There's a couple for Rob. The first one is that Rob, you make a link between diseases and intensive farming and reference AI. However, poultry farms affected by AI are very much infected through contact with wild birds, which are the reservoir of disease. And it's not really the intensive farms giving AI to wild birds. So first of all, do any of you have anything to say to that comment?
So I think we with avian influenza, we can differentiate highly pathogenic strains from those which have low pathogenic potential. And in the wild bird population, there's long been circulating a variety of low pathogenic strains. The current avian influenza crisis traces back to the intensification of poultry farming in China, where the encroachment of these intensive systems into the wild areas where there were wild birds was associated with the transition from low pathogenic strains to highly pathogenic strains. These intensive systems where you have birds housed in high densities, low genetic diversity, provide the perfect conditions for viruses to circulate and mutate. And this has happened repeatedly, not just in China, it's happened in intensive poultry farms across Europe as well. A low pathogenic strain is transformed into a highly pathogenic strain, and it's then re-released back into the wild. So it's not solely the responsibility of industrial poultry, but it's the interaction of those systems with the wild bird population which has led to the crisis we're seeing today, and which has repeatedly generated the conditions for these highly pathogenic strains to emerge.
Thanks, Rob. That's yeah, really great answer. The last part of that question was just about the picture of a US farm being different to European standards. I don't know if there's anything really to add to that. Yeah, you did point out that it was a US farm. Yeah, sorry, Rob.
I mean, yeah, there are differences in stocking densities and standards, but they're essentially the same model. It's highly intensive, fast-growing breeds housed in an indoor environment, and the welfare issues and environmental issues associated with those systems are common across the UK and US.
Okay, thank you. There is another question for you. Is there a similar comparison of land use for beef farming, including the US, including feed production, or is that only focused on tropical deforestation impact? Would also be interesting to understand the overall impact of feed production for monogastric animals. So I don't know if any of you want to take that as well as Rob.
So the slide I showed was focused on tropical deforestation, I think, but I mean, in the US, as with anywhere else, the issue we're grappling with is ecological opportunity costs. What could we be using this land for, and does having ruminants on it represent the optimal model of land use for environmental and human health outcomes? And as we've heard, there are lots of situations in which it does make sense to be farming ruminants, but I don't think we can take that as a blanket defense of the status quo. And on the feed crop point, I don't know the total land use, but 40% of global cereal production is fed to animals instead of humans. So there's a significant amount.
I think that's the thing that I find comes up the most really as an argument against agroecological farming and its extensive nature, and meaning that you end up with very high carbon and ecological opportunity costs, which is what you just touched on, Rob.
Izzy, can I just jump in?
Yeah, please do.
Point. And I think what's really interesting that that there is this, particularly through the academic literature, this idea of intensive or extensive systems, that we are seeing more and more farmers actually being able to have higher carrying capacity on their land for, so more animals, which I talked about, some of that research is coming out from changing their grazing systems or integrating land use. And I think one of the real limitations of current models is that they generally only attribute one output per hectare of land, for example. And I think what's really exciting is that we've got more and more research projects, more and more academics who are starting to model where we're getting multiple outputs from a piece of land. So for example, there could be a cereal crop that goes in the autumn, over the winter, sort of in the early spring, late winter, it's grazed by sheep, for example. So we've got a crop that's coming off there like a cereal. We've also got lamb production happening on that ground. That once that has been harvested, it may be that there's some sort of following cover crop, which then is grazed by cattle. So actually on that one field, there are 3 different products that are coming off that single area of land. And at the moment, we don't have sophisticated enough modelling that enables us to understand that. And the assumption is that extensive systems lead to more land being used, but that doesn't have to be the case. We know that on farms, and farmers are doing this all the time, but we don't yet have that translated into these modelling systems that are used, that are then informing policy. So we're at this very exciting moment where that is changing through some of the projects that are happening, and time will tell kind of what that means for land use options and potential in the future.
Amazing, thank you, Nikki. So another question, all 3 of the speakers have talked about transformative visions of the future of agriculture, in brackets animal agriculture, but who should have the power to decide where we go? Should that be the consumer with their revealed preferences that Rob mentioned, the farmers who live and work through the different production systems in practice, governments and voters through regulations or incentives? I'll open that up to anyone. It's a biggie.
Come back in another 2 years when I finish my PhD and I'll tell you.
I think, I mean, it's coupled to the power that different actors have. I would say, and it's not only me, it's also, philosophers working on this issue of responsibility, that, I mean, if you have a lot of power, you have great responsibility. So I would say the greatest responsibility is with the politicians. But what we see happening there right now is quite depressing, I would say. So I don't have much hope that they will, take this responsibility. But there's also many other very powerful actors in this system. So it's the industries, the retailers, and of course, I mean, everyone basically has a responsibility to act, within what they can do. I mean, as a farmer, it's very hard for you to change what people eat. But if you're a beef farmer or a poultry farmer or whatever, you can try to farm as sustainably as you can. Maybe you can look into, if you're in a very high intensive system, maybe you can, look for other avenues moving forward. So that's your responsibility as a farmer, and as a consumer, to buy the better meat. But also as a citizen, I would say that's much more important, to work as a citizen and engage in organizations, write to politicians and all this. So rather spend your time on that than, thinking too much about exactly what apple to buy, or, So I would say everyone has a responsibility, but it's very much dependent on what you have power over, so to say. And the more power, the more responsibility would be my answer to that.
I think that's an excellent answer. Thank you, Ellen. Anyone want to add anything to that?
Just that the redistribution of power across the supply chain and across the system is central to what the agroecology movement is trying to do. And I completely agree with everything Ellen just said. The moment power is concentrated in the hands of corporates and politicians, and that needs to be rebalanced and put back in the hands of citizens and producers.
Yep, totally agree. And I think that what we find in examples of agroecological transition happening is that the governance aspect is one of the key barriers that comes up again and again in system transformation issues, is that there is a limited support to decentralize and to redistribute power and financial structures to support that transition. And that's because the interests are concentrated. So agree with what the other two panel said.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm going to try and get through the last couple of questions. I've got a question: what is the contribution of animal breeding genetics to accelerate agricultural transition? I've seen Nikki again, you've highlighted you'd love to jump in.
Well, I'm sure that Rob will have a really good point to make around agroecology and genetics, but I just want to raise the point from a farm system point of view, is that what's really important is that we are selecting the right type of animals for our systems. So sometimes there's an assumption that, for example, native breed animals are best for agroecological or pastured systems, but actually what we need to take responsibility for as farmers is to make sure that we're making breeding decisions with our animals that match the systems that we have, which can help us move towards this idea of kind of maximum sustainable capacity or operating capacity, where we are only relying really on what our farm can produce to feed our animals as much as possible, and the type of animal that is best suited for that will depending on the farm. So I think there's an element of on-farm breeding and genetic selection and epigenetics and considering breeding decisions as a key part of that. But I'm going to hand over to Rob for gene editing or gene technologies, because I'm sure you'll have a view to give on that.
Thanks, Nikki. Well, I mean, the big picture is that breeding has gone badly wrong over the past half century, and that's where a lot of the welfare issues that are associated with more industrial modes of farming have come from, and particularly poultry, pigs and dairy. And the big picture is that we need to diversify animal genetics and as Nikki says, adapt the animals we're farming locally to the conditions and the landscapes in which they're living. Gene editing is an interesting one. There's a big debate going on around this at the moment in the UK, with legislation going through Parliament. The case can be made that these new genetic technologies can improve animal welfare and enhance the sustainability of systems, but there are also big risks attached to them. And I think we need to look at gene editing in the context of a broader regulatory framework around breeding. We need to fix genetics on the macro scale and not get drawn into too quickly into a specific debate around gene editing. There's lots to unpick.
Brilliant. I am seeing that we're about to run out of time, and I also want to hand over to Vanessa from Orselva to say a couple of words before we end. There was one more question. I apologise on the frustration about focusing on ruminant methane reduction, which is totally valid, and I think the speakers tried to address these in their talks, but I'm sure that all the speakers are very open to you contacting them with the email addresses they provided. So I just want to take this opportunity to say thank you so much again to our three fantastic speakers. I feel like you've painted a really hopeful vision based on evidence that, you know, we could have a system that works for one welfare, so for the planet, for human welfare and animal welfare. So I found it hugely inspiring, and I hope everyone else really enjoyed it as well. So yeah, please give them a round of applause from your desks or wherever you're sat watching them. Thank you so much. And I'll pass over to Vanessa now. Thanks again.
Hello, well, on behalf of Orselva, which is the Animal Welfare Science, Ethics and Law Veterinary Association, I just want to thank Lizzie so very much for chairing this session, and to each of our speakers. We've had a thoroughly thought-provoking and incredibly important set of presentations and a really lively debate. So thank you all very much on behalf of Orselva. And I also want to thank the attendees for joining us. For those who are not currently members of Orselva, do feel free to have a look at our website, find out about the organisation, which is open to everyone to join, and you'll see there details of our webinars and in-person conferences. People who are already Orselva members, I just want to remind you of the Orselva AGM, which is happening at 1:30. In the chat now, you'll see a link to the Zoom for Orselva's AGM. And please, members, do come along and help us with discussion about the organisation's future. Thank you again, Lizzie, and the speakers for a wonderful session. I'll hand back to you, Lizzie. Okay.
Thank you. I'll end it here. Take care, everyone. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks again.